On December 24th, 2002, Laci Peterson was supposed to be preparing for Christmas. She was 8 months pregnant. Her husband, Scott, told police he had left their Modesto, California home that morning to go fishing at Berkeley Marina. When he returned, he said Laci was gone. Their dog was still at the house. Her belongings were still there. Her purse was still inside. And her husband was suddenly telling investigators that his pregnant wife had disappeared. Police searched the house. They searched the neighborhood. They searched the streets around Modesto. And Scott Peterson became the man at the center of the search for his missing wife. At first, there was no murder suspicion. There was no body. There wasn't even certainty that Laci was dead. Just a pregnant woman who had vanished on Christmas Eve. Laci Denise Rocha was born May 4th, 1975, and by every account of the people who knew her, she was the kind of person a room got warmer around. She met Scott Peterson while they were both students. He was studying agricultural business. She was working toward a career in education, and the two became college sweethearts before marrying in 1997. By December 2002, Laci was 27 years old, working as a substitute teacher and 8 months into her first pregnancy. She and Scott had already picked a name for their son, Conner. She told friends she couldn't wait to be a mother. She was, by every description available, planning a future baby shower held. Due dates circled on the calendar for February. She had no plans to go anywhere. Scott Peterson was 24 years old when he married Laci Rocha in 1997. By Christmas 2002, they had built what looked, from the outside, like a settled California life. They had a home in Modesto. They had a dog. They had friends and family around them. And they were weeks away from becoming parents for the first time. The photographs from that Christmas season look almost unbearably ordinary now. Laci, heavily pregnant with their son, Conner, smiling beside Scott. The two of them at a holiday gathering the night before she disappeared, surrounded by friends and family. Scott looked exactly like the man everyone believed he was, a husband excited about becoming a father, a man whose life seemed to be moving in the direction he had always wanted. Christmas Eve began like an ordinary morning at the Peterson home. Laci was 8 months pregnant and, according to the family's account, expected to walk the couple's golden retriever, Mackenzie. Her car remained at home. Her purse and cell phone were still inside. Scott later told investigators that he left the house at about 9:30 that morning and drove roughly 90 miles to Berkeley Marina to go fishing in the new 14-foot aluminum boat he had recently purchased. He said he was alone. By his account, he spent the morning at the marina and returned to Modesto late that afternoon. But something had already gone wrong. A neighbor found Mackenzie wandering through the neighborhood that day with his collar and leash still attached. The dog was eventually taken into the Peterson yard. Laci was nowhere to be found. When Scott returned home, he said he discovered that his pregnant wife was missing. He contacted her family, and a search began almost immediately. Within hours, friends, relatives, neighbors, and police were looking through the neighborhood for a woman who was 8 months pregnant and had apparently left home for an ordinary morning walk. At that moment, nobody knew whether Laci had been abducted, whether she had wandered somewhere, or whether something much worse had happened. Scott's account of that morning would eventually become one of the central pieces of the prosecution's case. Not simply because he said he had gone fishing, but because investigators would later examine everything surrounding that trip. The boat he had recently bought, his searches for tides and currents, what he said he intended to catch, and even evidence about whether his story about fishing made sense. To understand what happened in December 24th, 2002, you need the weeks before it. Scott Peterson met Amber Frey on November 20th, 2002, through a mutual friend. Frey was a 27-year-old single mother and massage therapist living in the Fresno area. Peterson, then 30 and working as a fertilizer salesman, approached the relationship as though he were single. He wasn't wearing a wedding ring, and according to Frey's later testimony, he told her he was unmarried. They spent their first evening together at a hotel. On their second date, he carried Frey's 22-month-old daughter while they went hiking and cooked dinner for Frey that evening. The relationship quickly became more serious than a casual affair. Frey testified that Peterson spoke about a future with her and her daughter. Then, on December 9th, Peterson finally admitted that he had lied about his marital status. But even then, he didn't tell Amber that Laci was alive and 8 months pregnant. Instead, Frey testified that Peterson began crying and told her he had lost his wife. He told her that this would be his first holiday without his wife. Frey understood him to mean that his wife had died. When she asked whether he still wanted a serious relationship with her, he reportedly said, "Absolutely." By Thanksgiving, Scott Peterson was few days into his relationship with Amber Frey. At home, Laci was doing what any expectant mother in her final trimester does, nesting. Friends and family described those final weeks as full of ordinary anticipation, baby items being organized, a due date circled for February 10th, plans being made for a future that, as far as she knew, was arriving on schedule. On the evening of December 23rd, the Petersons attended a holiday party at a neighbor's house. By all accounts, nothing about that night raised alarm. Laci went home. The next morning was Christmas Eve. Scott Peterson's account of December 24th, 2002, was simple. He left the house that morning to go fishing alone, roughly 90 miles away, at Berkeley Marina on San Francisco Bay. When he returned home that afternoon, he says, Laci was gone. Her purse and cell phone were still inside. The family dog was found later that day, wandering the neighborhood with its leash still attached. Scott contacted authorities, and Laci's family soon joined the effort to report her missing. A massive search began almost immediately. Volunteers, cadaver dogs, searches of parks and waterways around Modesto, but as December turned to January, nothing surfaced. On January 3, 2003, investigators publicly asked for help confirming Scott's whereabouts that morning, a detail that, quietly, signaled where the case was already heading. A few weeks later, Amber Frey walked into a police press conference and, in front of the entire country, said the quiet part out loud. She and Scott Peterson had been having an affair. It had begun in mid-November 2002, while Laci was still very much alive, still very pregnant, still planning a life with their child in the picture. Frey said Peterson had told her he was single. That single sentence detonated the case. Investigators, working with Frey, began recording her phone calls with Peterson, calls in which he continued constructing an entire second reality for a woman who had no idea her boyfriend's wife was a missing person making national headlines. This wasn't the only crack. Weeks before Christmas, Peterson had purchased a 14-foot aluminum boat in cash without telling Laci and registered it in a way investigators would later find curious. He would eventually tell police the boat was for fishing trips, including the one he says he took the exact morning his wife disappeared. This shows the distance between what a person performs and what a person is, and about how long an audience is willing to keep believing the performance once cracks start to show. For nearly a month, America grieved alongside a husband who begged for his missing, pregnant wife to come home, then learned that same husband had spent the weeks before her disappearance building an entirely separate life, with an entirely separate woman, who had no idea he was married at all. The question this case forces isn't just who killed Laci Peterson. It's how completely a person can perform devotion while planning, or so a jury would eventually conclude, an exit from the very life he was pretending to want to protect. By March 3, 2003, prosecutors publicly said they were treating Laci's disappearance as a homicide. Scott, meanwhile, had sold her SUV. Investigators would later reveal he'd also arranged to sell his own truck and had access to a substantial amount of cash. Then, on 13th of April, 2003, The case's most devastating turn. The remains of a baby boy washed ashore near Point Isabel in Richmond, California, along the edge of San Francisco Bay. The next day, April 14th, the remains of a woman washed ashore nearby. Both were identified through forensic testing as Laci and the son she and Scott had planned to name Conner. The location was a matter of a few miles from the exact stretch of water where Scott said he'd spent that Christmas Eve morning fishing alone. Few days later, on April 18, 2003, Scott Peterson was arrested near a golf course in La Jolla, close to his family's home in San Diego, nearly 500 miles from Modesto. He had dyed his hair blonde, grown a goatee, and was found with roughly $15,000 in cash, multiple credit cards, camping equipment, and his brother's identification. He was charged with 2 counts of murder, first degree for Laci, and, under California's fetal homicide law, a second count for Conner. Behind the headlines, here is what the prosecution actually had to work with. No confession, no murder weapon, no witnessed crime, and, critically, no identified crime scene. What they built instead was a case of accumulated circumstance, and the strength of that case depends entirely on how you read each piece. On its own, infidelity isn't evidence of murder, but prosecutors argued it established something more specific: motive. By December 2002, Scott Peterson was, by their account, a man actively constructing a life that had no room in it for a pregnant wife. Telling his mistress he was unattached, days after purchasing a boat in cash that his wife apparently knew nothing about. Then there's the boat itself and the geography. Peterson said he'd gone fishing alone at Berkeley Marina, a considerable, solitary drive for a man whose wife was 8 weeks from giving birth. Prosecutors argued the timing of that trip, combined with the fact that Laci's and Conner's remains surfaced almost precisely where that boat would have been, was too precise to be coincidence. The defense countered that tidal patterns in San Francisco Bay could have carried remains from virtually anywhere in the bay to that same shoreline, meaning proximity alone proved nothing. Forensic pathologists also testified about Conner's apparent gestational development at the time the remains were recovered, testimony the prosecution used to argue about the likely time frame of death, in which the defense contested just as vigorously, since the state of the remains after nearly 4 months in the bay made precise conclusions difficult for either side to fully claim. And then there's behavior: the sold vehicle, the dyed hair, the cash, the direction he was driving when he was finally caught. None of it, individually, proves a murder. Together, prosecutors argued, it told the story of a man preparing to disappear. The defense, led by attorney Mark Garagos, pushed an alternate narrative that Peterson's family has continued to advance for 2 decades since, that a burglary at a home directly across the street from the Petersons' house, on that same December morning, might be connected to Laci's disappearance, that she may have interrupted the men responsible. 2 men, Stephen Todd and Donald Pierce, were in fact arrested in that burglary. Prosecutors argued the timeline and circumstances didn't support a connection. The defense has argued it was never adequately investigated. There was, in the end, no single piece of evidence that made this case. There was only a great deal of circumstance, all of it pointing the same direction, and a jury that ultimately decided the weight of it was enough. Given the volume of pretrial publicity in Stanislaus County, the trial was moved roughly 90 miles away to Redwood City, in San Mateo County, before Judge Alfred DeLucci, who barred cameras from the courtroom entirely. Jury selection began in March 2004. A panel of 6 men and 6 women was finally seated by late May. After the process worked through jurors who indicated they would be willing to impose a death sentence if Peterson were convicted, a detail that would matter enormously 16 years later. The trial itself stretched through the summer, built almost entirely on the pieces already described. The affair, the recorded phone calls with Amber Frey, the boat, the tides, the sold vehicles, the appearance at arrest. Deliberations were rocky. 2 jurors were dismissed and replaced during the process. But on November 12, 2004, the reconstituted jury reached its verdict: guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances in Laci's death, guilty of second-degree murder in Conner's. Gasps and cheers went up outside the courthouse. Inside, Peterson showed no visible reaction. A month later, on December 13, 2004, the same jury unanimously recommended a sentence of death. On March 16, 2005, Judge DeLucci formally imposed it, describing the killing of Laci Peterson in stark terms as an act that was, in his words, cruel, uncaring, heartless, and callous. Peterson was sent to San Quentin State Prison the following day to begin what appeared, at the time, to be a fixed and final chapter. It wasn't. In August 2020, 16 years after the verdict, the California Supreme Court overturned Peterson's death sentence, ruling that the trial judge had improperly excluded too many prospective jurors who'd expressed general reservations about capital punishment, tilting the jury pool toward the prosecution before a single piece of evidence was heard. Crucially, the court left the underlying murder convictions fully intact. This was a sentencing error, not a verdict on guilt. 2 months later, the same court ordered a separate review into a juror known during trial as Juror Number 7, Rochelle Nice, nicknamed Strawberry Shortcake by trial watchers for her hair color. After it emerged she had failed to disclose, during jury selection, that she'd once sought a restraining order of her own while pregnant, fearing for her unborn child's safety. That review ultimately did not produce a new trial. A judge later determined it didn't rise to the level of prejudicial misconduct requiring one. With the death penalty off the table and the Stanislaus County District Attorney's Office declining, in 2021, to pursue a new death sentence out of consideration for Laci's family, Scott Peterson was formally resentenced on December 8, 2021, the hearing where this story began, to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Laci's murder, plus a concurrent term of 15 years to life for Conner's death. That has not ended the legal story. In January 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project announced it was representing Peterson, actively investigating what it calls a claim of actual innocence. Since then, his legal team has pushed for renewed DNA testing on several pieces of evidence, including a mattress recovered from a burned van in Modesto around the time of Laci's disappearance. Courts have granted only limited retesting, including, notably, on duct tape recovered near the scene, while declining broader requests. As of the most recent reporting, Scott Peterson remains incarcerated at Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California, his convictions upheld, his innocence claim unresolved, and the case, more than 2 decades old, still being challenged in court. Somewhere in the volume of appeals, sentencing hearings, and innocence claims, it's worth returning to the person all of it is actually about. Laci Peterson was 27 years old. She was 8 months into a pregnancy she had planned for and wanted. She had a name picked out for her son. She had a mother who still, more than 2 decades later, describes missing her every single day. None of the legal machinery that followed her death, the trial, the death sentence, the reversal, the resentencing, the ongoing innocence claim, changes the plain fact underneath all of it. A young woman and the child she was carrying never got the future they were preparing for. What makes this case endure isn't really the forensic detail. It's the gap it exposed between the performance of a grieving husband and whatever was actually happening underneath. A gap wide enough that an entire country watched a man cry on television for a wife he was, according to a jury, already planning to be rid of. 2 decades later, that gap still hasn't fully closed. Scott Peterson has never confessed. His family has never stopped insisting the wrong man is in prison. The Los Angeles Innocence Project is investigating Peterson's claim of actual innocence and has argued that newly discovered evidence warrants renewed examination of the case. In this case, more than almost any other in modern American true crime, was built entirely out of circumstance. Laci Peterson's disappearance changed more than one family's life. The following year, Congress passed the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, legislation informally known as Laci and Conner's Law, allowing federal prosecutors to bring separate charges when a fetus is harmed during certain violent crimes. It is, whatever else this case remains, a permanent piece of legal legacy carved out of one Christmas Eve in Modesto, California. But the legal story did not end with Scott Peterson's death sentence. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned the death sentence because of errors in jury selection, but it left his murder convictions intact. Peterson was resentenced in 2021 to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Then, in 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project took up his case and began pursuing new evidence, including additional DNA testing. A judge allowed testing on a piece of duct tape recovered from Laci's clothing, but rejected requests to test several other items. In 2025, the Innocence Project filed a habeas petition arguing that newly presented evidence supported Peterson's claim of actual innocence. In April 2026, a judge rejected that petition. Peterson's convictions remained intact, but his attorneys said they planned to appeal. So more than 20 years after Laci disappeared, the legal argument is still alive. Scott Peterson is, as of the most recent reporting, still incarcerated, still maintaining his innocence from a cell in Ione, California. Laci Peterson and her son Conner are still, more than 20 years later, the reason any of this is still being argued about at all. Whether the story ends there, or whether a courtroom somewhere reopens it one more time, is still, remarkably, an open question. If you found this story touching, please consider sharing it with someone else. And if you haven't already, subscribe. It helps us continue telling the stories that deserve to be remembered, not for the crimes that ended them, but for the lives that came before. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.